Hi, and welcome to another episode of Sandhill Road, the show where I talk to successful startup founders and their venture capitalists about the companies that they build and invest in. And the goal, like always, is to give you a sense of what it's like to be in their shoes. And today, I'm super excited to be joined by Joe Doliner, JD, who is the co-founder and CEO of Pachyderm. Put very simply, Pachyderm is version control for data. So what Git, GitLab, and GitHub does for code, Pachyderm does for data. In particular, large datasets. Think Hadoop, MapReduce, or Spark scale datasets. So this means that Pachyderm helps you track the state of your data over time, backtest models on historical data, share models and results across teams.
Let's start with a hot dog. Holy shit!
And revert to previous states of the data. As such, Pachyderm is, in my opinion, building a core piece of the infrastructure for the large dataset or big data developer and application ecosystem. When they started out in 2014, when companies wanted to get serious about big data analysis, they had to hire an elite set of programmers with their specialization in Hadoop and MapReduce jobs.
They have to meet our rigorous standards. I mean, look at the three we've already hired. Just look at them.
There they are. Stallions.
Each one more magnificent than the last.
Or they could contract a third party like Cloudera, but neither of these options were inexpensive undertakings. And this is exactly where Pachyderm with their open core model came in. Having worked as a data infrastructure engineer at Airbnb in 2014, JD realized the complexity but also the potential of solving these large dataset version control problems. And so he set out to build Pachyderm. Today, Pachyderm is a fast-growing tech company financed by some of the best names in the valley. They were part of the 2015 Y Combinator winter batch. After going through Y Combinator, they raised a $2 million seed round backed by the likes of Data Collective, SUSE Ventures Foundation Capital, and the Crunch Fund. It was really interesting to hear from JD in this episode that from this seed round, it wasn't really a linear pathway to Series A.
Okay, the only way that we can get this company to survive is like if we can't raise money from investors, we've got to raise money from customers.
So last November, they closed on their 10 million Series A led by Benchmark. And in this episode, JD shares the really interesting journey on how this Series A was really a long time in the making.
And it wasn't until the next year when we went to talk to Chathan, and now he'd moved to Benchmark. So he was at NEA for the first conversation.
So I'm super excited to dig into the founder, product, and funding journey of Pachyderm. So let's dig right in. So for the first question, there was actually a little bit of a problem with the recording. So I asked JD how he found his co-founder and how the YC journey went. And he told me that the first time he applied to YC, it was actually on his own. And it was only after he got rejected for a first time that he and his co-founder joined forces. But let's hear it from him.
And so it was at that point that I went to Joey and said, and I'd of course told him that I'd been applying to to YC and stuff. This wasn't totally out of the blue for him. I told him like, look, like they didn't let me in, but here's what they said. It was all very, very positive. I think I'm going to apply again in 6 months. One of the main things that they said I should have at that point is a co-founder, and I think that you're exactly the right guy to do that. And so then we sort of started talking about like why we thought that we would be the right sort of mix of co-founders to do a company like that. And, my basic premise for that was that for a company like Pachyderm or like RethinkDB, which was a database company, the two sort of most important aspects of the company are the technical engineering aspect and the sales and operational aspect, because you need to be able to, sell into big enterprises and navigate their org charts and their procurement processes and everything like that. And so I felt like we needed to have a founder who was going to be really, really interested and want to do those parts of work, not just be willing to do those parts of work, but that's actually, the thing that they wake up in the morning thinking about. And so, Joey and I have a very, very natural split in how we work on the company in that I focus on all the technical stuff, and I wake up every morning thinking about how can we make this product better, how can we make the technology faster and meet our users' needs better. And Joey wakes up thinking about how can we get this in more people's hands, how can we get this into companies and get them to be successful with it and get them to pay us for it and get our message out there at conferences and everything like that. And so that was basically how the conversations proceeded, was us just figuring out, like, was this going to be a good partnership?
And then basically you were working on this already before YC, at least intellectually, for a couple of years. And then you went through Y Combinator. A lot of people who go through Y Combinator, at the beginning, they don't really feel like, especially those who go directly from a large technology job into YC, they often tell me that they don't feel like a real company in the beginning, and only after they sort of incorporate, get all the mentorship and do the pitching and the demo day, that at the end of the process, they really feel like they have a real company there. And
that is certainly, I think, matches with my experience very well. I mean, YC is some of the best early validation that you can get. And, to anybody who is thinking of applying to YC, like, that alone is definitely not a good enough reason to do it. Like, YC will not take you from zero to a company, but YC will help you to sort of like put together and realize and have the self-confidence that this idea is actually something that people are going to be willing to pay for. And I think that a lot of where this comes from in YC is less to do with like any of the individual partners or stuff that YC the organization does, and it has a lot more to do with the community and the fact that you're just surrounded by people who are at a similar stage in their startup, and they believe in their company and they believe in your company, and you sort of like help each other out. I experienced a very similar thing when I went to college, where in high school I sort of had some wonders of like, can I actually be like a math major? Can I actually like hack it at a top university and do this stuff? And then I got in there and I got in a classroom with other people, and I started realizing like, oh, I know these concepts, I can do this. And it was just like having those people around me made me believe that I was one of them.
So you go through Y Combinator in January 2015. You then basically launch the first version of your product, which gets covered on TechCrunch. And at this point, Pachyderm is built already quite heavily into the whole container ecosystem, building on Dockers. And at this point, I think in the fall when you went through Y Combinator, I think Docker had just raised their Series C, 40 million Series C.
That sounds right.
Starting to hit some traction, but you were taking some platform risk, and probably when you went out to pitch it to investors, they might not have been that familiar with the whole Docker and Kubernetes ecosystem that would emerge later on. So how was that process, pitching this to investors, and also how do you think about taking this platform risk at that point in time?
So I always felt that taking those risks was sort of one of the best things that we could bet on, just because I had a lot of confidence that if I knew nothing else about how to found and run this business, I at least knew what the open source ecosystem looked like at the time and sort of how to navigate that, because that's just the world that I've been embedded in since I learned how to program. I'm always reading about like the latest infrastructure, open source projects and things like that. So I had a lot of confidence that Docker was going to succeed. And we actually had the really, really good fortune that sort of set us on the path to founding this company, which was that really, really early on, back before Docker was Docker, back when they were .cloud, Solomon, the guy who originally wrote Docker, went on sort of a little tour of Silicon Valley to just like demo it to anybody who'd watch to get feedback on it. And RethinkDB happened to be one of the places that he came to demo it, because he was good friends with the founder there. And so we got to see this like really hacky early version of Docker before anybody else did, before I think they'd even released it at PyCon, that we looked at it, and I at least knew, and I think most of the people at RethinkDB knew, like, oh, this is a really awesome way for deploying code. Like, this is a really big problem that, like, we have and everyone we talk to has, and this is going to solve it. So I had a lot of confidence in Docker. In terms of this being like kind of a headwind in the early days, it totally was. There was, a long process with fundraising where, like, there was a certain set of investors who were just like, we're not sold on Docker yet. And so if we're not sold on Docker, then, like, your company makes absolutely no sense. So we don't want to invest in you. And so that was a sort of large percentage of investors, certainly not the majority, but like a meaningful chunk that we sort of just couldn't get to talk to us in the early days. And it was actually even more of a headwind when we were talking to customers, because there, we could go and talk to some customers and they could say, look, we think that Docker's really cool too. We think that Docker's the future, but we have the reality of our company's infrastructure right now that we're working with. And the reality is we don't use Docker. We deploy everything on EC2. And so if we're going to need to learn to use Docker to use your product, then that's like, we basically need to use two products. Just to get the value that you're offering. And so the trade-off wasn't there for a lot of places. And, there were even more places, like, this doesn't happen anymore, but in the early days it would happen where we'd go in and they just hadn't really heard of Docker. They'd maybe heard the word before, but they didn't know what it was. And so you can kind of imagine how those sales pitches go, because, like, the first 45 minutes or so you spend explaining Docker, because Docker's not a super simple thing. And then at 45 minutes in, if you've done your job well, the people are like, okay, we understand what Docker is. Like, this makes sense. What do you guys do again? Like, did you guys write Docker? Yeah. And so then you go into the Pachyderm pitch, and that's just, like, never going to work at all. The good news is, though, that things have definitely flipped since then, and all of the tailwinds have become headwinds. And so now when we walk into a company and they ask us, okay, the benefits of your product seem really interesting to us. How do we deploy this and stuff? And we just say, oh, you just deploy it directly on Kubernetes. And they're like, oh, great. So I just tell my, like, Kubernetes administrator, like, hey, I need a namespace for Pachyderm, and, like, you give me a YAML file that I throw at it, and we're done. And we're like, yep, that's how it works. Now that's really, really awesome, because now there's just so many places where that means that we can, like, go right into their infrastructure directly without having to have any sort of a complicated deployment process. And that was really one of the original things that we wanted to fix. I mean, one of the things that my team did at Airbnb was we built the Hadoop clusters, and that was often a, like, many months, like 6 months process of just drawing out all of the sort of, like, Terraform scripts and how are we going to have all of these EC2 nodes and who's talking to whom and everything like that, just to get a cluster up and running that people could use. And so going from that to, we've already got Kubernetes running, I just throw, like, some text at it, and all of a sudden everything springs up and it's all, like, architected correctly and everything's connected and all the logs are captured and stuff like that, is one of the really big leap forwards we feel we provide compared to Hadoop.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. That probably in the Series A, which I think you closed in last fall, people were already fully on board with what Docker is, and you could going right into what Pachyderm actually does. So let's dig a little bit into the product, I would say. Let's start a little bit with the basics of the product and try to make this really, really simple for the audience to wrap their head around.
Yep.
So let's say you have on the one side, you have some data, then you have some code that transforms this data, and I think you call this a data pipeline. And at the end of this, you get an output, a result. And if you were to implement this in a cloud infrastructure system, I would say probably most often you see an AWS S3 object storage instance where the data is stored. Then you basically spin up your Docker image for the data pipeline. You might also run it in more than one node orchestrated through a Kubernetes container orchestration system. Then you do the analysis and then you get the result back. You store it back into the object storage. Is this how it works, or am I oversimplifying it?
That's basically exactly how it works. Yeah, I mean, you could go into more detail, of course. Like each of these steps has a lot of, like, things you have to answer in terms of, like, well, what happens when it fails? What happens if the node you're on, like, magically disappears, because that happens sometimes on the cloud. But I don't think that those are particularly important details to have here. Yeah, that's basically exactly how it works.
Okay.
You just described it.
Okay, then maybe let me take it a step further to basically understand a little bit how Pachyderm maps versus Hadoop. So the way I understand it, Pachyderm has built its own file system, the Pachyderm file system, which is a little bit like the HDFS system,
Yep.
file system that we know from the Hadoop ecosystem. But the way I understand it, in the Hadoop clusters, most of the modern Hadoop clusters, they bypass the HDFS and they store directly to S3. And the way that I understand, at least, the Pachyderm file system is that you're kind of putting data into the container and then taking it out, but the data lives somewhere else. So maybe shed some light on how this actually works.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do sort of the same thing that you just described, which is that everything is ultimately stored in S3. When we put data into a container, what we do is we take the user's code. So let's say that they've got a container that runs a TensorFlow job on some data. And so the first thing that we do is we boot up that container, and then Pachyderm goes into the container and it downloads the data from S3 and it writes it into the container's file system. And so that's ephemeral. That's just stored on the sort of like local node. And if the container were to die, that data would go away and we'd have to re-download it. But assuming it doesn't die, what happens next is we boot up the user's process, whatever code they told us to run, and that code starts running, and it finds in the file system all of the data that it needs to access. And so it can just read that off of disk like any program reads any file off of disk. It can do whatever it wants to it with it, and then when it's done, in this case when it's trained the model, it's going to write that back out to disk in a special place. And so after their code exits, then our code goes back in and it slurps up all of that data that they outputted, and we just stream that right back into S3. And we, just sort of checkpoint it into there. So this thing that you observed about how people who are running Hadoop have sort of moved to storing a lot of stuff in S3, that's a shift that was sort of just starting to happen toward the tail end of when I was using Hadoop at Airbnb. And it sort of flew in the face of one of the big performance benefits of HDFS, which is that HDFS sort of always advertised that they bring the computation to the code. So when you fire off a computation to happen, you've got all of these different nodes that are storing some small subset of the data that needs to be processed. And what HDFS would do, or really what MapReduce would do on top of HDFS, is it would send these computations to the nodes where the data is stored, process them there so it doesn't have to move the data around. And then it would aggregate the results into one place, which was a lot more efficient at a time when bandwidth within a data center was actually a limiting factor on these computations. But people can just kind of realize that the bandwidth within a data center is so high, and the bandwidth of getting data out of S3 from within Amazon's data centers is so high that this optimization just wasn't worth it anymore, especially because storing stuff in S3 is just so much more operationally simple than running HDFS with all of these hard drives that can fail and nodes can go down and stuff like that. So people just switched to this much more operationally simple thing that had some slight performance penalties, but was ultimately those performance penalties weren't really that important. And we just sort of leapfrogged straight to that because we just realized that storing stuff in S3 was going to be the simplest thing to do, particularly in a container environment where, it's containers can come up and down even a lot more frequently than VMs. And so we just use S3 to store all of this stuff. And it's very, very simple. And you can basically store your entire Pachyderm cluster in an S3 bucket.
So maybe let's move on a little bit to the competitor product. So you're highly integrated with Kubernetes and S3, as we just talked about. And so one of the competitor products out there is DVC, which is highly integrated with Git. So what went into your thought process? And we talked earlier about how you were a strong believer in Dockers and Kubernetes. But how do you think, as a result, Pachyderm is perceived differently from DVC, or how do you position yourself in the marketplace? You would say, if I could say it, it's probably you're more geared towards the really large tech companies, but I'm not sure whether that's really the case.
I think that is the case, and I think certainly our user base reflects that. I think more than anything, we're geared toward large data sets, which generally large companies have larger data sets than small companies, although that's obviously not a strict rule or anything. We're also much more geared toward the sort of operational, like I have this pipeline and every single night I dump my databases into this repo, and then I want the pipeline to run, and then out the other side I want there to be machine learning models and reports and all of these things, versus I want to perform experiments on this data. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, but I want to, like fire off a job that does this, and maybe I get back something that's totally useless, or maybe I get back something that's really interesting, and then I fire off another job based on that. We're much more geared toward the prior use case there. Looking over, I took a sort of look over DVC's like website and marketing material before this podcast. I haven't actually used it yet. I remember when DVC came out, and I thought it was pretty interesting. I think that DVC does a lot of the same things that Pachyderm does, targeted at like slightly different use cases, slightly different scales, and things like that. I think that DVC is also a lot more tuned directly toward machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's like what all the stuff on their site talks about. And Pachyderm tries to sort of be a little bit more generic of a data processing system. And in practice, people use Pachyderm a lot for machine learning. But when I go into a user's cluster who's using it at machine learning, and I look at what their actual like pipeline DAG looks like, there's like a bunch of nodes that are doing machine learning, and then there's way more other parts that are just like cleaning the data and reformatting the data and doing quality checks on it and doing quality checks on the model as an inference like that. And in actuality, like it's a lot of them are kind of boring. Like a lot of them are just like things like, pivots and stuff that you can do in Excel. It's just that when you're doing that on petabytes of data, when you need to make sure that this runs every single night, when you need to be able to like trace it all back to its origin in case like something looks funny, like that becomes a much more interesting problem.
So let's talk a little bit about business model. Pachyderm is open source, but you're operating under this open core model where you also have an enterprise version. So I had Sid from GitLab. I think he was in the same YC batch.
I know Sid. We were friends.
I had him on the show actually yesterday, and I think you used to beat him on the Nintendo during YC. I think he recounted that once.
Yeah, I'm a lot better at Nintendo than he is.
Yeah, so basically, he had this whole process of like going through like the donation model, the service model. So did you land directly on this open core model? Or what was the iteration process there?
So there was some iteration process. There was a lot less iteration for me than there was for Sid, for the simple reason that Sid and GitLab were probably like 3 or 4 years ahead of us when they got into to YC. Like they already had a product and business and everything like that, and we were still working on the MVP of our product. And so I got to short circuit a lot of that process by just having a few conversations with Sid and him telling me like, look, I've tried all of these things, I've systematically iterated on them, like here's what works, here's what doesn't work, things like that. And so our business model is modeled a lot off of the learnings of GitLab and sort of looking around at other companies that have been in similar situations. Our board member, Chathan, who's the guy at Benchmark who did the investment, is also on the board of Mongo and Elastic. And he's not actually on the board of Docker right now, but someone else at Benchmark is. And so he's got just a lot of like, information on how every single company has accomplished this. And so we sort of realized that an open core model was really what made the most sense to us. Because as you said before, like our offering is very naturally tuned toward big companies. And there's a bunch of features that those big companies were asking us for that we hadn't heard a thing about from a lot of our open source users. Like the best example of this is sort of authorization and governance features of being able to say like, all right, who owns each piece of data and who's able to access this data and what do I do to get access and things like that. And so those are the features that we wound up building for our closed source enterprise offering. It's like that. The other aspect of our business model, which we're just sort of writing and rolling out now, is the sort of hub component of it. So just like GitLab is an enterprise product that you can like pay them for and you can like run on your own servers. And a lot of that is open source. I think most of that is open source. But you can also just go to gitlab.com and use, a hosted version of GitLab with all of the enterprise features, and you can pay for it like that. And that's a really, really natural business model for a product like Git, because Git is all about collaboration, right? And it just gets a lot nicer and easier if you can just put this up on the public internet rather than having it on your company's internal servers. And the same exact thing applies for Pachyderm. Pachyderm is basically like Git for data science. And so it's all about collaboration on data and things like that. And so we're building a hosted hub solution for Pachyderm right now that we're going to be launching in the second half of this year. That's basically for people to get all of these enterprise features online in a hosted solution where, they're just paying us for the hosting costs.
I heard you announce this product before, and I think it's going to be really exciting. In terms of the enterprise version, what's sort of the threshold where people upgrade from the open source self-hosted version to the enterprise version? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think on the enterprise version you have a lot of visualizations, features.
Yep.
Maybe talk a little bit about the threshold when companies start upgrading to the enterprise version.
So normally the threshold comes from like some sort of specific need, and we've identified like probably 5 or 6 of them that we've got in the enterprise product that we just don't have in the open source. So the biggest one I would say is like the authorization features of just being able to like pin down who all of the different users are and integrate with LDAP and stuff like that. That's just something that you find at big companies that like a guy who's working on a weekend project is never going to ask you about, because it's his cluster. He owns all of it. Visualizations are a big part of it too. Right now, Pachyderm open source, for you to sort of set up Pachyderm open source and then do like an interesting data science project on top of it, you've got to have a pretty broad skill set. You've got to basically be like at least a competent DevOps engineer, at least a competent data engineer, and probably a really good data scientist to do something interesting on top of it, which, some people are. A lot of people are, but not everybody is. And so companies often, they want to be able to have like our data engineering team like understands how to go directly into Kubernetes and see what's wrong and find logs and stuff like that. Our data scientists don't like to do that so much. And so if they can have just a graphical interface where they can click in and see like, here's some data, here's a pipeline, I want to put this data into this pipeline, something went wrong, like click the button, show me what happened with it, and things like that. Like that allows them to focus on what they're good at a lot more, rather than having to muck around in like Kubernetes, container land, and stuff like that, which is not that interesting to them. So that's one of the big triggers. There's also just sort of advanced pipeline profiling and performance, things like that. So like the ability to see like this pipeline is running slowly, like tell me more about why that is happening. Another I will say like pretty big trigger is just the support that comes with the enterprise product. We have like open source support channels, which means we have a big Slack channel with all of our users in it, and people ask questions and we answer questions. But for enterprise users, like we give them private support channels and we'll get on the phone with them. And if there's, anything, any blocking bugs or anything, we'll get those fixed really, really quickly. And if they need a new feature that's something we haven't thought of before, like we'll work with them to design that and get it implemented and things like that.
So talking a little bit about customers, maybe you can mention some of the flagship customers and use cases. We haven't really touched on this. For me, like the archetypical use case is really this Airbnb, large geolocation data sets. But maybe you can give us some flagship customers and use cases of people using Pachyderm today.
Yeah, absolutely. So one example is actually the Department of Defense, and we get used by a couple of defense departments. But most recently, the United States Department of Defense used Pachyderm for hosting this competition for doing image recognition on drone footage. So basically, like they had a whole repository of drone footage collected from drones that are flying around, and they wanted to host a competition to the public where people attempt to implement algorithms to detect what's going on, like be able to say, here's a hospital, here's a tree, things like that. And so they implemented all of that on top of Pachyderm. In this is a pretty like clear data pipeline problem, wherein you have like at the top all of this drone footage, and then a user submits some code to run, and they create a pipeline that runs that code against the footage and gets a score from that, and then sends that score back to the users. We're also getting used in sort of a lot of geological studies things. We recently onboarded Shell, the petroleum company, as a customer. We also get used in a lot of biomedical sciences. So have you heard of the company AgBiome?
Yes.
Yeah, they do basically microbe design for agricultural products. Pachyderm also sees a lot of interest in financials, financial industries. So we're working with the Royal Bank of Canada to build out basically their whole data platform that their data scientists use to consume data and process it into forecasting models, into loan algorithms and things like that.
These make a lot of sense to me. Financial services, definitely one where you have really huge granular data sets, also image recognition. So let's talk a little bit about scaling Pachyderm. So you raised this 10 million Series A I think in November, which was led by Benchmark, and you're now basically in this scale-up mode. So talk to me a little bit about what keeps you awake and how you're deploying this capital now. I assume a lot of it goes into engineering work and probably sales, but maybe talk a little bit about how you think about scaling this company.
Yeah, so this is one of the newest aspects of the sort of whole startup experience for me. This is, the company is past the point that I experienced at RethinkDB and well before the point that I experienced at Airbnb. So I haven't really seen a company go through this type of a stage, the inside. The main thing that keeps me up at night is just thinking about how to build out and structure the employees in a way such that everybody is productive and satisfied with their job and not getting burned out, and so that it doesn't become sort of the demoralizing state that a lot of big companies can reach. And so right now Pachyderm has a very, very flat structure. We don't really have any managers outside of the founders. And we have sort of intentionally kept it that way for a while and are just now getting to the point where we're thinking about starting to hire some actual professional managers. And so one of the big things that I'm thinking about is, how do I make this so that it doesn't have the downsides that people typically associate with like inserting layers of management and things like that? And how do I let engineers sort of still be engineers and kind of drive the company? I think one of the examples that I try to look to is Google, which I think this isn't true anymore, but for a very, very long time into Google's life, the company was really like an engineering first organization, and it was really run by the engineers, and the engineers kind of had the leeway to explore the ideas that they found most interesting. And Google benefited a lot from that. They found a lot of interesting ideas. And so I want to sort of make sure that we build a similar engineering first organization without making it so that like sales are second class citizens that need to just like figure out how to fit in and coexist around engineering, and how they can actually do their jobs too. So, it's a tricky problem, and I don't think any company actually does this perfectly. You just sort of try to avoid things that suck as much as possible. Is I think the best you can do it. And sometimes there isn't a way to solve it. Sometimes it's just like, look, we need to get everybody on the same page about this, and people are confused, and so that means we're going to need to have a meeting together, and nobody likes to be sitting in a room with like a million people all like trying to talk about the same thing in a meeting, and nobody's really quite sure what it is, and people have a hard time getting their voices heard. But like sometimes you just sort of have to do the best known solutions to these problems. I've intentionally avoided, like, some companies try to have like really, really innovative management structures and things like that, and like a concept of just like no bosses at all. Like Valve, the gaming company, does that, and we're not doing anything that far afield. We try to do like fairly standard things. I just try to make sure that like we're not becoming a demoralizing company, basically, that we're not turning into something where we're treating our employees just like human assets and stuff like that, and people don't feel like we're hearing their voices.
Human resources, I think.
Exactly. I mean, the name, we don't have any
yeah.
human resources officially at our company right now. Like, we don't have a human resources department. And I know that can't go on forever, but the term human resources just feels so demoralizing to me.
Yeah, I hear you. So maybe a last question is, so from the outside, Pachyderm looks really like an all-around success. I mean, you've gone through YC, you've raised a seed right after, or almost right after it. Then you've now gone to a Series A. But were there some points where you sort of hit the roadblock and you felt like this was going to fail, and you were thinking to yourself, what did I do leaving Airbnb for this grueling startup journey?
There have been many points like that, and I will certainly say that while from the outside Pachyderm looks like a success, we're still fairly early in the startup journey. There's still the most likely scenario for the company is that we die, and we're going to have to really work hard and do a lot of things right to make that not be what happens. To point to sort of a specific case, before we raised our Series A, so we raised our Series A at the end of last year, so I think it was like September of 2018. The entire year of 2017, we were trying to raise our Series A and failing. And we were failing basically because the company and the market just hadn't matured enough. And, we remained pretty confident throughout that this was still a good idea with a big addressable market, and that we had the right solution for it. We just kind of needed the market to some time to like breathe and congeal around us, and for our solution to kind of like grow into it. But the entire year of 2017 was just every single investor that we talked to said no. Almost every single customer that we talked to like wasn't quite there. We had a ton of things sort of fall through at the last minute, and we were really getting worried that the company was going to just die. And things sort of didn't turn around until the very end of the year. I think it was like basically over between Christmas and New Year's, something like that, like very end of December. We were sort of getting pretty close to the end of our runway. Okay. We hadn't been able to get any investors to say yes. And so we realized like, okay, the only way that we can get this company to survive is like, if we can't raise money from investors, we've got to raise money from customers. And so simple, yeah. Right? Like who needs investors when you've got customers? And so at the very, very end of the year, like I said, like it must have been like right around Christmas, Joey managed to close BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, for a large six-figure contract. I think it was just shy of $500K. And so getting that was both, great, because that was the money. Like we looked at that, we're like, oh shit, we just closed, like 6 more months of runway in one contract. But then also once we saw that, we realized like, oh, we can close contracts this big. Companies are going to be willing to pay this amount of money for Pachyderm. And so once we sort of had that, things really started to change around in 2018. And we closed a couple more large 6-figure deals. Investors started to become a little bit more receptive to us. And that all sort of culminated in in the end of 2018, when we finally raised money from Benchmark. One more sort of funny story to throw in there was that actually one of the investors that we talked to during 2017 when we couldn't raise money was Chaitin, who ultimately wound up investing in us. And that was the conversation with Chaitin was probably one of the most demoralizing conversations, because we had our first meeting with him and we were like, we felt like that went great. Like we had never had an investor so engaged. Like he understood the problem. He understood the solution. He just was really, really into it. And then we didn't even get a second, like a second conversation with him. And that was when we really started questioning. We're like, are we just like completely wrong? Like, were we just sitting there in the room thinking that he was loving it and secretly like he was just like looking at his watch, like, when am I going to get these guys out of here? And so we sort of just like, I guess we were wrong. Like, chalk it up, like, keep on moving. And it wasn't until the next year when we went to talk to Chathan, and now he'd moved to Benchmark. So he was at NEA for the first conversation. And we talked to him, and he was super interested again. Or he was still super interested. And we were like, well, what's going on? Like, you seemed super interested before. Then you said no. He's like, well, NEA, after the conversation that we had, I went back to the partners and told them I'd talked to this awesome company. And they were like, look, this just doesn't quite fit into our portfolio thesis. We're looking for, NEA is like the biggest investment firm in the world. And so they're looking to deploy like $300 million into a company that's going to IPO within the next 5 years, rather than into a startup like us where they're going to deploy like 10 million and we're going to like IPO in 10 years or something like that. And so it had nothing to do with the quality of the company that they had said no to us. It was just the situation of the investment firm at the time, things like that. And so that's why, like, it's really, really important if you're trying to raise money or doing anything with your startup that you not let any one data point affect you that much, because there's just so much going on in any one decision, and it's really hard not to, because like you're out there sort of like bearing your soul, or at least you're in a very vulnerable position when you're trying to get people to invest in your company that you've spent years and years and years working on, and so the fact that they can say no because it's like not because you've done anything wrong, it's just because we're looking for investments with this time frame that we can invest this much money in, and like the numbers here don't match. And that's perfectly reasonable for investment firms to do. Like they've got to have sort of a thesis and a way of doing business and stuff like that. But it feels very personal, and that one definitely, like, that one hit both of us pretty hard. The most important thing for all of this stuff is that, being with a co-founder where you really do believe in each other and believe in the idea, and you can at least sort of come back at the end of the day and say like, look, this person didn't invest in us. I don't know why. It sucks. I think they were wrong, but we're just going to keep going because, I still believe in you. You still believe in me, and we both still believe in this company.
Yeah, that's a great story. I mean, I recently talked to Joseph Jacks, who's running.
I know Joseph.
Yeah, and we talked about how for a long time it was really hard for venture to wrap their head around the open core model, the commercial open source software ecosystem in general. And then, I mean, you have people like Peter Fenton at Benchmark who've invested in this space for a long time. And I think NEA, they just moved very much into the later stage deals over time.
Yeah, and I get when I talk to other entrepreneurs, particularly ones who are just starting out, I get a lot of questions that are sort of like, I'm thinking of doing this, but I've heard that investors don't like it when a company is like this. Like, do you think I should do this instead? And I always tell them, like, maybe, if it's really, really important that you raise money from those investors who think that, but generally you shouldn't be making that many decisions in your company based on like what investors think about in funding, unless they sort of make inherent sense to you as a founder. Absolutely. So like, investors like to see revenue and they really like to see profits. That's a really wise stance by investors. Like you should totally make your decisions based on that to align with what investors are thinking. All of the other sort of like trends that investors get into and things like that, like you want to keep your finger on that stuff a little bit. You want to understand it, but ultimately you should really be able to make up your own mind on that stuff. And investors change their minds on this stuff all the time. Like we've just watched it. We've already seen a few cycles of it. We've gone from receiving investor skepticism about the container ecosystem and people asking us, okay, so like, how do you eventually expand beyond the container ecosystem, to then all of a sudden we just never get that question again, because all of a sudden it's just like, it's like a switch flips. And, we heard about this from our investor Chaitin, and we part of the reason I think that Benchmark were the ones who ultimately did our round was because Benchmark is a pretty independent thinking VC firm, and they don't really follow trends, at least nowhere near as much as other VC firms. They sort of have their own beliefs that they stick to. And so we talked to a lot of investors during our Series A who were just like, we don't quite understand what category of product, what category of company this is that you guys are building. And then as soon as Chaitin did the investment in us, he started coming back to us with these slide decks from other companies that were raising money that were like, yeah, we're a competitor to Pachyderm. And like all of a sudden this has become like a category that you can raise
validated.
On because other investors were just like, oh yeah, well that makes sense. Benchmark just did this round. Like Benchmark's really smart and forward looking. They must know something. So we got to invest in a company like this too. And this could be infuriating to a lot of entrepreneurs. Like it's been infuriating to me on several cases, but you sort of just have to, you have to have enough self-confidence to know when an idea is good, even if investors won't validate it for you at that moment.
I love that. I love that. And let's end on this great note that you shouldn't always cater to external validation as a founder. I think I love that. Where can people find out a little bit more about you, about the firm?
So I mean, they can find out more about Pachyderm just at pachyderm.io. That's our website. We have our blog and everything there. We have a pretty active Slack users channel that's just slack.pachyderm.io, I believe. I have a personal blog and a Twitter that's not very frequently updated, so that's where people can go to learn more about me.
Okay. Perfect. So this is it for today. I hope you found it useful. I think Pachyderm is a super exciting company, and I'm really looking forward to follow their journey. And if you want to hear more about what I'm up to, you can always subscribe to my newsletter on sandhillroad.io, or just subscribe to the channel and tune in next time. It's up to you. Cheers, guys.